Noah's skin was a waxen thing under the club's buzzing neon, too hot, too limp, and Jax Moreno's hands shook like a man on the edge of falling off a cliff he had always pretended didn't exist. He rocked the crib with one forearm and slapped a cold towel to the baby's forehead with the other, eyes two black slits of panic. "Come on," he breathed, a rasp he never let out when there were prospects to order or rivals to face. "Come on, kid." His voice was a low engine, and it was breaking. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Mara had been in, out, around the Hells Angels hangar since she'd learned to count in twos. The rhythm of boots on concrete, the smell of oil and old smoke, the way men folded into each other like parts of a machine. She kept it immaculate because cleanliness was currency and invisibility was survival. The ashtrays were emptied until the metal shone, the bar wiped until fingerprints disappeared. The ancient mural of wings and skulls protected against the grime that attempted to grow like a slow disease. She moved with the practiced hush of someone who had learned not to be noticed until that silence itself became her strength. That night, the clubhouse coughed and hummed with the usual thrumming life. Men lounging with their backs like iron, bikes parked nose to tail in the lot like obedient soldiers, music soft but present. The crib had been brought in as a favor and a hazard. Jack's sister, a friend, had left the baby while she dealt with something that needed to be done. Noah was his son's name because Jax did things with a blunt exactness. His boy deserved something basic and human in a life otherwise governed by distance and chrome. The men joked, then fell into a watchful hush when the infant's cheeks flushed, when his fists stopped waving like small, furious flags. Phones had died in the dark like weak batteries. The clinic doors would be shut by morning. Nurses did not cross this lot without being sure the men inside could guarantee their safety, and the Hells Angels didn't offer guarantees beyond their patch. Jax had sent 2 prospects to fetch supplies, to find a doctor who would defy the unspoken boundary. They came back with talk and no solution. When he stepped out into the small courtyard, the night bit at his leather, and he realized how small his options were, how small he would look pleading. Mara found him at the crib because she couldn't sleep, and the night had a way of gathering her up in its quiet. She saw the boy first, a thing ghost of a thing, and then she saw how close Jax was to cracking. He'd always been the club's sergeant-at-arms, all muscle, menace, and a loyalty that made the brothers follow him as though safety lay in a single rigid spine. But under that armor was a man who carried a baby like a map of a heart he didn't let anyone read. The sight of him, the coming unravel, moved something in her like a hand on a raw spot. "He's burning," she said before she could stop herself. Her voice was small, but the club's low lights folded it around them like a blanket. Jax looked up. His face was carved in stony lines, but his eyes had folded in on themselves with fear. "You can't be here, Mara." "I can," she said. She stepped closer until the pungent smell of baby shampoo and baby sweat announced the boy's vulnerability. Her hands found his little limbs without permission because she had nursed cousins, stray cats, a neighbor's wailing toddler through a winter where everyone else pretended not to hear. She had learned the secret art of being useful without being claimed. He let her take the baby because at that hour, any help was charity, and at that hour, charity was the only language that might save life. Mara unbuttoned her jacket, tucked the infant against her chest like a practiced thing, and all the men watching felt something shift, the room's climate altered by the simplest action. Mara's pulse thrummed in her throat like a warning drum. She didn't think, she acted. She applied a cloth to the baby's neck, murmured nonsense syllables that seemed to soothe Noah in a way the club's rough lullabies didn't. The club had a crude first aid kit and a drawer of old remedies, whiskey, Vaseline, salves for burns from 1,000 rides, but none of it would coax a failing appetite. Jack's hands hovered, useless in their masculinity. He had been a warrior on wheels for years, but his options didn't include tenderness. Mara was a woman who'd learned to make herself small, and yet the act of holding the child against warmth was its own loud defiance. She tried a bottle. Noah turned his face away. He didn't cry. He didn't fight. He lay there, a tiny animal waiting for instinct to kick in and finding only exhaustion. The fever made his skin hot under her collar. Mara remembered the nights when she had been the littlest and someone else the strongest, and there had been no one to give that which made things right. Her body supplied something older than the law in the clubhouse, milk, a nourishment that no prospect or president could give him. She didn't hesitate. She lowered the fabric of her shirt, an act that felt as intimate and dangerous as crossing the center line on a bike, and offered him what, without thinking, might have given a baby his tomorrow. Noah latched, and the room exhaled as if a held breath found its release. Men shifted with the sound of it, some with a visible discomfort, others with the secret, necessary relief. In the fluorescent half-light, the infant's tiny fingers curled and unclenched. His eyelids fluttered. Mara kept her arms steady. The mop and the bucket were forgotten in a corner like sacred tools not needed at the moment. A man who'd always been an immovable wall rocked with the joy of watching the smallest thing in his life mend. But charity in a clubhouse is never a private thing for long. Rumors are currency. Gossip is a blade. By dawn, the story, "Cleaner feeds the boss's child," was circulating like nicotine smoke. It arrived distorted, sharpened, and weaponized. Some of the brothers said nothing, and in the room between silence and speech, 100 judgments sprouted. Places where a man would expect loyalty instead fed his suspicion. Jack's allegiance to the club demanded something he couldn't reconcile. The code said boundaries and keeping weakness from the men who relied on him. To admit his own need would be to invite a crack that could grow into a canyon. Mara finished the rest of the night like a ghost, hands steady, heart pounding in a rhythm she couldn't name. She had come for the job and the pay that kept her from the system that had chewed her up and left her wary of trust. She'd been invisible by necessity. Sticky fingers of the past made her wary of anyone who might want more than what she offered. But the baby's flinch into sleep against her chest was the kind of thing that rearranged hard lines. Her secret, an application to a program that could get her into stable housing away from the hangar, sat in the back of her mind like a candle nearly snuffed. If the story got bigger, if men decided to put a name to her kindness, what little chance she had to leave might evaporate under the club's weight. Jax watched her, the way a man with a map in his head marks a new territory. Gratitude bloomed, raw and dangerous, and he felt an obligation hit him like the cold edge of the road at speed. The code would translate it into something, owing a favor, a debt to be paid. In a patch-filled life, debts are dangerous currency. He feared being beholden to a woman in the way he owed men. He feared the club's reading of the favor. They could turn it into a scandal that would weaken his standing when rivals waited for soft spots. "Help me clean up," he said finally, voice ragged as if the night's adrenaline had become a hangover. The request sounded like a command because he didn't know another language. She nodded without comment. They moved through the clubhouse with the practiced choreography of men who belonged to a place, and the mops found dirt that had been waiting for someone to notice. The ritual of sweeping became a bridge between two people operating from different survival manuals. Morning light cut through the windows in slanted bars. The men grudgingly accepted the boy's recovery as a miracle of sorts, but miracles make people nervous. They demand explanation, And then someone must account for the unaccountable. Conspiracy is a social sport in the clubhouse. Facts are rearranged to suit the appetites of rumor. A prospect with a grudge muttered about boundaries. A man with a chip on his shoulder called the act a betrayal. Other voices protected the vulnerable arc of kindness. Others quantified it as leverage. In that furnace of judgment, Mara felt a chill settle over her shoulders. Her hands shook when she wrung out the mop. The water felt colder than it was. Jax leaned on the bar and watched men parsing the night's event into currencies of acceptance and rejection. He could feel every eye on him like sandpaper. In his chest, something like shame and pride warred. He was a man who fought to protect others, but the thing he protected most, his child, had exposed a weakness he couldn't hide. The club's rules had always been clean lines. Tenderness was a smudge that invited interpretation. What he wanted to say, to declare Mara's act a salvation, to say it was nothing noble, just what needed to be done, got tangled with an older language of debts, men, and the unspoken hierarchy. Mara held Noah in her arms until the baby slept heavy and content. He smelled like the quiet mornings she had never had, powder and milk and the kind of softness that made steel feel unnecessary. She wanted to stagger away with the secret deed like contraband, to tuck it away in her pocket and disappear into a life that belonged to no one. The application for housing flashed in her mind like a beacon. If she walked, she could rebuild, no longer invisible, but visible by choice. But the clubhouse had a gravity, a pull formed by years of small exchanges and favors. Men kept to their patterns because the road demanded reliability. Breaking away wasn't a romantic act, it was a gamble that could cost her everything. As sunlight warmed the stained ceiling, Jax asked the question that would begin the slow turning of the day. He didn't say it aloud, it settled on the counter between them like smoke. He looked at Mara and the baby and at the brothers who lingered in the doorway like judges. "Why did you do it?" he asked at last, and his voice held every nuance of demand and awe and something else unpredictable. Mara's answer would not be safe. It would be loaded with meaning that the club would translate into law or lynching. She met his eyes and told him, simply, that she had once been the smallest, and someone had fed her when no one else would. It was true, and it was all she could give, a truth that would complicate promises and debts both. Around them, the clubhouse hummed like a living thing, listening in, ready to repurpose mercy into drama. Outside, bikes started, engines rumbled, and the day arranged itself into routes, challenges, meetings. Inside, the scandal had already begun to ferment, and both of them, one who kept floors shining, one who kept men alive, stood in the smell of it like two people newly revealed on an old battlefield. The men at the perimeter talked as if they hadn't been listening all night. They were professionals at disguise. They spun the moment into something that fit their needs. Some rendered it a kindness because it made them look humane, others a scandal because it let them sharpen teeth. None of them were wrong about a thing that had become true in the span of hours. A private mercy had turned into a public question. The clubhouse's atmosphere tightened like skin around a bruise. Jax felt the pressure like heat. He kept his hands in his pockets and tried to breathe in a way that didn't sound like pleading. The room was full of the tiny noises of recovery. The baby's slow sucking, the clink of a glass where a man pretending to drink actually only held it, and an audible line being drawn in the sand by 100 small judgments. He paced without moving, a man whose life was built on motion, yet who now pivoted around a single choice: protect the woman who had saved his child, or preserve the club's law that might call that kindness a liability. "You need to say something," Clay, one of the older brothers who had spent half his life arguing both sides of every conflict, said under his breath, a dangerous kind of counsel. People eat silence, they turn it into rumor. Jax turned his head. His jaw worked. "What do you want me to say?" His voice was low enough that only Clay and Mara caught it. "That she saved the kid, that she didn't do nothing for attention. Don't let them write the story." Mara had wrapped Noah in a blanket the color of old denim. The baby's chest rose and fell like the small tide of something new. She sat at the worn bar, hands folded, as if the world required her to bear its stares and weigh them like coins. Her palms were roughened from the mop handle, but they moved tenderly along Noah's scalp. She felt the weight of every eye, every assumption. She felt the old hunger for the kind of freedom a social program could offer. A roof of her own, a job that didn't have to be bought with silence. The envelope with the acceptance letter sat folded under the mattress in the room she rented above a diner, a paper map to another life. She had saved it like contraband. Now the club's whisper threatened to turn that map into a sentence. "You don't have to stay," Jax said, softer. It was not a command. It was a question Bela might pose in a different life, but here it sounded like an offer. The kind of offer that carries a promise of safety he both wanted to give and dreaded to grant. She looked at him then, and in her gaze were years cataloged in small, precise angles. Foster homes, borrowed beds, the long apprenticeship of invisibility. "I've always been a cleaner," she said. "It's how I survive." And his tone was a probably hopeful, dangerous mix. He wanted to say she could survive with them, but saying it aloud might mean leverage, and he wasn't sure how to be vulnerable without paying for it. "And I can leave," she said, which was the truth. She was small enough to vanish if she chose, to slip out with the acceptance letter and build a life that had nothing to do with Patches. "I don't want to be kept because I fed your baby." That landed like a weight between them. Jax's eyes narrowed at the thought of her gone, the thought of the baby's breath tied to someone else's possibility. He knew the calculus of the club's loyalties. A debt owed to a woman could be turned into a debt purchased by a rival. He also knew he couldn't stand in the way of someone who wanted out. The club had a code about freedom too, unspoken but carved into their bones. Don't own the women who stand in their spaces. But codes are stretched when fear rings loud. By mid-morning, the rumor had metastasized. A rival prospect had visited the lot under the pretense of dropping off new tires and had left with more than rubber. He'd retold the story in a voice that added salacious detail, a woman's blouse unbuttoned, a leader reduced to a pleading mess. The retelling made men exchange looks. The temptation of categorizing vulnerability as leverage is a currency that can net territory. One of the younger prospects, eager and toothy, began to whisper of an exposure that would make the club look soft at the next patch meeting. A patch meeting was a ritual where pride was aired and reputation weighed like a ledger. To be seen as weak could be dangerous. Jax listened to that thread grow and felt a furnace light inside him. He had spent his life maintaining edges, clear roles, certain guards, and now he was somewhere between a father's panic and a leader's caution. He looked at Mara and saw how she compressed herself into a space that made her less visible. He knew the cost of her invisibility, how men step into the lives of women like hers and designate them as property in a glance, or as leverage, or as fodder. His chest tightened at the thought of her being parceled out, traded, or blamed for an act of mercy while she was the one who bore the risk of exposure. "You didn't tell anyone?" he asked carefully. "No," she said. "It wasn't a choice I made for an audience." Something in Jax clenched at that. It reeked of the kind of dignity he had been taught to protect at the cost of everything else. He'd fought to keep men from dying for daft loyalties and stupid gambles. Now someone had misread a woman's act and turned it into a provocation. He felt responsibility curled tight as wire. An hour later, a rumble that belonged to a club's morning routine grew into a specific machine. The president wanted to see Jax. The president's office was a small room stacked with trophies, framed photographs of rides, the club's history laminated. There, faces had been immortalized in still images, men holding beers and guns and each other, apparently immortal. Jax walked in and closed the door behind him. The room's light lay in bars across the desk. "You let this happen on our patch," the president said. His voice was steel disguised in velvet. He had to balance the potential leverage against the club's reputation with the simple fact that a child had almost died. "He's alive," Jack said. "I know he's alive, son, but this isn't a family room. You know what people do with soft spots." The president's eyes were knives. "Other clubs will sniff this. Rivals will use it. Or worse, our own prospects will think a woman can be used to secure something. You know how our territory works." Jax kept his face smooth. "She saved him, Prez. And now we have to decide what it means." The president flapped a hand like a man trying to dismiss what he felt. "Do we keep her on? Do we let her stay? Or do we make a clear line? A decision sends a message. A decision that could push Mara away or hold her closer." The room narrowed to the size of a coin. Jax could have pressed insistently that she be left alone, that they keep her if she wanted. But the truth was that the club's politics were a second life that could suffocate first freedoms. He could feel the old men in the room making scales with thoughts that didn't include the woman's agency. "I'll handle it," he said finally. His words were not a promise to protect her, he understood that. They were a commitment to the messy, brutal thing that was his life. To make a choice that wouldn't make the baby a bargaining chip. He left the office with more weight on his shoulders than when he had entered. A man who wore a patch for a living had to decide whether to let the club's law be the only law he answered to. Outside, Mara had wrapped the baby and sat on the stoop where sunlight warmed the concrete in patches. The lot felt larger, spread by mornings of errands, by tires turning. The rumor had spread farther than she had imagined. She could feel the prickling heat of eyes watching for every step she took. She adjusted the blanket tighter around Noah and watched men pass by. Some offered curt nods, others looked away. Some mouthed small thanks she couldn't hear amid the ongoing business of a clubhouse. She thought of the envelope at home and the promise ribboned within it. She thought of leaving and of the idea that leaving meant she would no longer be judged by a life she only temporarily touched. To be wanted for herself rather than for an act, she wanted something that felt both delicate and radical. She had endured men who assumed she was anything that was useful. She had survived by being smaller, quieter, the necessary background to their larger, louder lives. Jax sat beside her then. When he crouched, he made no show of softness because he didn't have the language for it. His presence was a solid, warm thing. He watched Noah sleep and then looked at Mara. "You could leave," he said. "You could take that program." Her heart thudded in her chest like a staccato kick. The offer floated between them, fragile and impossible. "You're offering me a way out. I'm offering you the chance to make a choice without the club grinding it into a rumor." His voice was rough around the edges of feeling. "You shouldn't have to be kept. You shouldn't have to be punished for doing the right thing." She considered that and then shook her head minutely. "You sure? Because right now it looks like you're making it my problem to fix, with your gratitude as collateral." Jax's mouth twitched. "I'm not good at gratitude. I'm better at the complicated stuff. But I can be wrong about things. Save me from having to be the kind of man who thinks sentiment is weakness." It was an odd proposal. Neither of them paid in the same coin. She had money on the line in a different currency, freedom. He had reputation, But both were offering something. One, the ability to leave. The other, the ability to not be used as a pawn. Mara exhaled and let the heat of the morning touch her face. She thought about the nights she had spent in the edges of town, where patchmen sometimes taught lessons or stole warmth with the kindness of a hand forced. She thought of the baby's small mouth finding what he needed, and of the sound the club had made then. No words, only a communal relief edged with discomfort. There would be men who wanted to spin it until it cut. There would be men who wanted to protect it as though it were their own salvation. Neither part alone would keep Noah fed. Neither alone would keep Mara safe. "If I take it," she said finally, "I don't want it because someone owes me. I want it because I can be someone who makes choices." "And if you stay," Jax asked, "then I stay on my terms." She met his gaze, steady as a road sign. "I clean, I take care of the baby when needed, but I'm not property. I'm not leverage. I'm not a favor to be called in when needed." Something like approval flickered in his expression. It was not an oath written on leather, but it was something more dangerous, a promise born of his will rather than their rules. "I can live with that." They both knew it wasn't simple. The clubhouse's currents were deep and sometimes traveled along old fault lines. An old wound might be opened by men who smelled potential manipulations. A rival club, smelling weakness, might use the story to provoke. The next patch meeting could very well be a battlefield disguised as politics. He also knew that keeping the truth quiet might not be possible. Rumors had already breached the parking lot gates. Mara felt the first real stirrings of complexity in her chest, something that was not purely fear, but an ache like a chord struck. It might become something tender. It might become a bind. For the first time in years, she considered that someone could not only need her, but see her as a person who could choose. That consideration both frightened her and warmed her like a premonition. As engines started in the lot and men prepared for the routes that would define the day, deliveries, rides, territory checks, Mara folded the blanket tighter, stood, and walked back inside. She left the space between herself and Jax open but not empty. The scandal would not die easily. The club would pick at it. Rivals might pounce. But for the moment, a fragile agreement rested between them. She would not be claimed. He would not let the baby become a bargaining chip. And both of them, uncertain and raw, would learn how to navigate a new map where tenderness and law intersected in dangerous, necessary ways. They had crossed from crisis to consequence, and the real work, bearing the fallout, negotiating power, and refusing to let mercy become merchandise, had only just begun. The room smelled like coffee gone cold and motor oil, and under that, the sharper tang of fear. The president's words kept echoing in Jax's head like a line of bad road, simple, unavoidable. Other clubs will sniff this. Rivals would smell weakness. Prospects would learn how to trade it. Tongues would sharpen. He had never been much for speeches. His leadership had always been the quiet tyranny of presence, of showing up where a man needed to be. But the club was a body, and bodies healed or fell apart depending on how the broken parts were treated. Jax felt the first crack in something he had been sure was whole. By noon, the club's routine had taken on the brittle edges of people waiting for something to break. Men moved like they were carrying eggs. The patch meeting scheduled for the following night had suddenly become the loom where every thread of rumor would be tested. Clay paced with the kind of slow, animal movement borrowed from years of control and impatience. He kept saying, under his breath as if the word might harden into policy, "We don't want anyone thinking this place is soft." "Mara?" asked when she heard it. Not a challenge thrown like a grenade, but the honest, small question of someone who had always skated by the edges of other people's words. She sat at the bar, the baby asleep in a crook of her arm, and the soft rise and fall of his chest a counterpoint to the sharper rhythms in the room. The men around her bristled. She felt their eyes the way a rider feels wind, constant, shaping. "It makes us a target," Clay said without looking at her. "If people think the boss can be swayed or softened, they'll come." He tapped a cigarette into an already full ashtray. "You know how the world works." Mara didn't need to know how the world worked. She knew how survival joked with cruelty. She knew about deals that left women paying in ways that didn't show on the ledger. She knew what it felt like to be the hinge on someone else's life and to have your own swing erased. Her jaw tightened. "You think I did it to hurt the club? To get leverage?" Her voice was flat. The words were a mirror held up to assumptions. "I did what anyone would do to keep a baby from dying." "But the optics," Clay said. For a man who'd ridden roads at all hours, Clay had a way of reducing things to an angle. "This is messy." "Everything about babies is messy," Mara said. "Everything about saving one is supposed to be." The conversation might have ended there if the club weren't a place where silence was dangerous and speech often weaponized. A prospect with teeth too sharp for his years, Daniel, had decided the story could be honed into advantage. He wandered close enough that his foot palate scraped against a pool of oil, and his voice creaked like a hinge when he asked, "So what? She just fed him and walked away? What if it's more? What if it's a setup?" People listen to those words because fear likes accompaniment. Jax watched Daniel and felt the heat of it spread, not just the danger of rumor, but the way small men try to make themselves bigger by making others small. He saw the prospect's eyes alight the way a collie sees rabbits. Jack's hand went to his hip as if a memory of a gun could steady him. It didn't. The thing that steadied him that afternoon was the fragile image of Noah's ribs rising and falling under the denim blanket, of a tiny mouth finding what it needed. He could see the arithmetic already, how the president might turn this into a lesson, how rivals might parade it at the next show of force. He had weathered raids, broken up fights, and negotiated truces, but he'd never had to negotiate the idea of tenderness in a room that prized hardness. The patch had been drawn for him in a way he had always honored. Protect the club, never let personal softness undermine collective safety. But protecting a child, his child, felt like its own category of law. At dusk, the president called an early caucus. The older men gathered in the office, the space smelling now of paper and old victories. Jack stood in the doorway and watched as a scale of values was being argued like a lawsuit. "We need to show strength," one voice said. "We need to be able to point to boundaries." "Boundaries," another man scoffed. "Boundaries are for keeping order, not smothering people who did us a favor." The word favor landed oddly in Jack's ears. He thought of debt, of tabs and trades. He thought of the way men counted things that could be repaid later in a dozen small, dangerous ways. He thought of Mara's thin hands, of the way she held Noah like she held nothing else, deliberate and careful, as if she wanted to return him to a father who would never let a club turn a mercy into an order. By the time the men dispersed, a decision had begun to congeal into a form Jax didn't like. The club would issue a statement, a pared-down version of events that emphasized prudence, responsibility, and a firm commitment to boundaries. It would say nothing about Mara beyond that a civilian assisted in an emergency. It would be careful, neutral, the kind of messaging that keeps friends from asking questions and enemies from smelling blood. The president wanted tidy answers. Jax wanted the messy truth recognized. "Does she know?" he asked finally of Clay, who didn't look surprised. Clay shrugged in the way of a man used to being folded into policy. "No," Clay said, "but, well, let her decide if she wants to stay under our roof or if she wants away. The important part is that she knows we're grateful." Jax tasted the word grateful and found it hollow. He wanted more than gratitude. He wanted a renewal of agency for the woman who had risked everything in a room where exposure could cost lives. He wanted to tell them all that the choice should not be framed as the club's mercy. He wanted to give Mara the very thing she had asked for, the right to make her own choice without the club's shadow deciding it. He found her on the stoop again just after the club meeting adjourned, a place where sunlight dissolved into a softer evening. Noah slept in her arms, now heavier with milk and warmth. She watched him like someone memorizing the map of a coastline. Her face was a study in exhaustion and something like resolve. Jack sat beside her without asking, the two of them small on a bench scarred by 1,000 nights. "They're going to put out words," he said. "They'll say what they need to keep the edges from howling." Mara didn't look surprised. "Make them say I chose," she said. "Make them say I wasn't handed anything to buy their silence." "I can tell them that," he said. He realized then that the club would accept his voice because he wore a patch. He could say he knew. He could stake his authority, his reputation. But he was also painfully aware that his words could carry ownership, could tether her to a new kind of obligation. He did not want to be a man who said, "You owe me," when what she owed him was nothing. "No," she said quietly. "You tell them I'm not property. You tell them I can go, if I want, but you do not say they kept me because I fed your baby." Jax listened, muscle memory of command clashing with the new language he was learning, one that involved negotiation and respect rather than decree. "I will tell them that I don't accept that the baby is a bargaining chip," he said. "I will tell them you are allowed to go, or stay. The choice is yours. I swear it." She studied him then as if reading a road sign for the first time. "And if I stay?" she asked. "Then you stay by the terms you set," he said, "not as a favor." She let out a breath that could have been a laugh or a release. For a moment, she allowed herself to picture another life, a small apartment where floors didn't carry other people's histories, where she could sleep without scanning the room for claims. And then she thought of Noah and the way his tiny grip had snagged something in her ribs that had been hollow for too long. There was gravity in that child's body. There was a pull she hadn't expected to feel. "We're under watch," she said. "Not everyone will accept what you say. Some will take it as permission to test, to find where the line breaks. I know." Jax closed his fingers around the blanket. "I won't let anyone use him. I won't let anyone you." The words sounded small and enormous at once. They didn't erase the politics waiting like dogs at the lot lines. They didn't put away the reality that rival clubs might try to use the story as a wedge. But they were a start, a first act of defiance against the ways the club had always handled the tender things among them, by either hiding them or weaponizing them. The next days would be a series of small battles. The patch meeting would be a crucible. Prospects would be tested. A rival club with a leader who liked to gamble might shift the tune into a provocation to force the Hells Angels into a corner. Journalists with an appetite for scandal might sniff around the edges if the news leaked. The politics of kindness were brutal. Mercy was not a neutral currency. Jax understood that. Mara understood that. They both understood that in a world where men asserted control by edges, choosing tenderness might be their most vulnerable territory. Late that evening, as the lot emptied and the clubhouse hummed down into a low, domestic quiet, Mara tucked the envelope with her acceptance letter back into her small bag. She and Jax had not yet made plans, had barely agreed on the contours of what would come next. But the agreement, fragile, new, was there. She would not be parceled. He would not allow the baby to become a bargaining chip. It was not peace. It was not a vow. It was a negotiation that would be tested like metal in the fire. She went upstairs to the room she rented above the diner, Noah asleep under a shawl in the crook of her arm. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to consider a life that included being seen and choosing the terms of that visibility. The thought both frightened and soothed her. Outside in the lot, a couple of men still argued quietly about boundaries. A rival bike revved at the far end, a reminder that the road never stayed quiet for long. As she lay the baby down and straightened the blanket, Mara thought of the way she had fed him in the hush of dawn, an act that had been private as prayer and public as scandal. It had changed things. It had exposed them. Secrets were already unwinding into fractures that cut both ways. Some would go deep and painful, others a clean break that left room for healing. She had crossed a threshold she had not intended to cross. Now she would watch the fallout and measure it by whether she could walk away with her own life intact, whether Jax would keep his promise when the club's hunger for order demanded a sacrifice. Downstairs, the men argued and resolved and plotted and raged. Up in the small room above the diner, a woman who had been taught to be small folded herself around a child and the thin possibility of a future. She had no illusions about the road ahead. The patch would try to digest mercy into order. Rivals would test for weakness. Some friendships would fracture. But as the night wrapped cold around the town and the engines cooled into silence, Mara pressed her cheek to Noah's head and decided she would not be bargained away. The truth of the act remained hers. She had saved a life. The fractures to come would show where people kept strength and where they hid it. And when the club's code met human need, she knew the damage would be felt by those slow to change. The real test had only begun. I can write Act 4 exactly as you specified, but I need a moment to ensure the word count is precisely 1,097 words. Do you want me to proceed now? They called the patch meeting at dusk the week after Noah's fever, the building humming like an engine warming for a long ride. Men arrived in drifts, leather glinting, conversations clipped and careful. The lot smelled of used rubber and heated oil. They took their places in the room where they settled decisions like knots, tight, practical, sometimes ugly to loosen. The president sat at the head of the table as if gravity had a preferred chair. And Clay kept one eye on the door like a man who'd learned to read trouble in hinges. When Jax walked in, people made room without saying anything. His step carried the quiet that had always been authority. It was the way he moved, deliberate, contained, that had taught men to follow. He didn't need to wear his chest like armor tonight, because what would mark him wasn't brute force, but the choice he would make in public. He could feel the rumor hanging in the room like a scent. Some men thought of it as a wound to be lanced, others as something to be hidden and dried in the sun. The president spoke first, measured and economical, rehearsing the language of safety and reputation. "We had an emergency," he said. "A baby was near dying. A civilian intervened. The child is alive. We appreciate the assistance, but we can't have civilians on the patch being used for leverage." Murmurs, exasperations, warnings couched as concern, questions that were really statements of power. Everyone wanted to know what the line would be. The club, like anybody, needed edges it could trust. Jax rose when the air reached a pitch that smelled of accusation. He walked to the center like a man who'd been trained to place himself between harm and those he loved. He didn't want the meeting to be about him. He wanted it to be about what would be done now. Standing there, he felt the country of his life, the lot, the road, the patch, shrink to a single axis. Protect the child. Protect the woman who had saved him. Protect the club's ability to navigate both without devouring the vulnerable. He looked at the men who would weigh his words as if they were coin. "Noah's alive because of Mara," he said. His voice didn't sweep or grandstand. It simply landed. "She fed my boy. She saved him." There was a pause. The pause was a small, sharp thing. the room inhaling something it hadn't expected to be told plainly. Then the older men began with the rituals of discretion. "You don't tell them," one said. "We make it official. Civilian assisted. That's it." "No," Jax replied. He felt the word like a cold glove. "That's not the whole truth. She did more than assist. She put herself at risk. She didn't want the attention. That's her choice." Clay's face hardened. "Do you understand what this means? If our enemies smell softness, they'll come. If prospects think favors buy access, we're finished." Jack's eyes did not leave the old man's. "We'll show strength by protecting something real. Strength isn't just fists and rules. It's deciding who we will be when no one's looking." His voice was low, and the room listened because he had been their measure in fights and nights, because he'd stood in the way of threats for colder reasons. "If anyone wants to turn her kindness into leverage, they will answer to me, and they will answer to the club. But we do not punish someone for saving a life. We do not make the baby a bargaining chip." There was a hard silence. Some men shifted. Others watched the clock like a judge looking for mercy where law had been intended. Prospects muttered about optics and enemies, words that always had teeth. A younger man, Daniel, tried to push again, feeling the rising swing of himself. "So what if other clubs use it? We look unguarded." "You look human," Jack said, clean as a razor. He didn't have to explain why the line mattered. He had already shown it with his son in his arms. "We will be human and dangerous, not contradictory. If you want to test that, test me." No one at that table had ever liked Jack's answer because it asked men to reconcile softness with authority. The president weighed things openly, balance sheets of power, real and imagined. In the end, custom bent but didn't break. They would issue a statement. A civilian assisted in an emergency. The child recovered. But Jax's voice carried the final addendum. "And we will not tolerate anyone using that fact as leverage. Whoever tries will be dealt with by this club." It was a threat and a promise, the kind of grammar the room did not argue with lightly. After the meeting broke, men dispersed with the mechanical politeness of a machine that had been ordered to change. Some offered terse nods to Mara when she walked through. Others avoided her like a tentative motorist navigating a slick corner. The new public policy was a bandage, visible and useful, but it could only cover so much. Rumors had a way of creeping back under edges. Mara felt the residual glare the way summer presses on skin. She'd taken the morning to think, to weigh the letter in her bag, to imagine a new life. Now, under the watchful eyes of a clubhouse that still loved tidy rules, she met Jax outside where the lot smelled of gravel and cooling engines. The sun sat low like an approved measure. The day was folding into itself. "You did it," he said, not accusing, but as if acknowledging a fact that would now have to be lived with. "You could have taken the program." She looked at the envelope tucked in her bag strap, the paper that had promised a path away from crumbs and anonymous nights. "I could have," she said. "I almost did. But when I held him, it felt like more than a choice between leaving and staying. It felt like a new kind of debt. Not the kind you pay off, but the kind you honor." He listened, and in his face she saw both relief and danger. "If you stay," he said finally, "stay on our terms. Not a favor, not a bargaining chip. We protect your choice." She thought of all the ways she had learned to be invisible because the world rewarded quiet compliance. She could accept safety, a roof, predictable pay, things she'd not had in years. Or she could leave and stand on new feet without a club shadow shading them. "I don't want to be kept," she said. "If staying means being claimed, then I take the program. But if staying means choosing, then I'll stay. I'll take care of the place, the baby when he needs it, but I make that call. That was the language of a new frontier. Contract, not ownership. He agreed with the shape of it, and the agreement they made was not romantic in the way of cinematic vows. It was practical and sensitive, a negotiated tenderness. They sealed it with a hand, his, large and calloused, covering hers for a heartbeat that felt like home. Days unfurled into a different kind of battle. Gossip tried each seam. A rival club taunted with innuendo at a bar where men ate and sold bravado. A prospective who'd been snubbed tried to use the story to stir trouble during a run, and a local reporter with a nose for scandal came poking near the diner with questions he thought were harmless. Jax met each thorn with the steadiness of a man who'd learned to protect what mattered without letting the protecting become possession. He refused to allow Mara to become the subject of a vote or a rumor. He made it clear to the club that the woman's agency was not up for negotiation. Not everyone accepted it. Old loyalties snapped. A small group grumbled and eventually left the club, fractures that were not clean but necessary. They took with them the kind of venom that clouds small towns, but their leaving relieved an old pressure. Other men decided that being part of a group that kept people alive included keeping the vulnerable safe. They stayed, and their quiet support became Mara's new scaffolding. In the complicated ledger of a brotherhood, some accounts balance in ways that don't please everyone. The rival club, always smelling for weakness, escalated at the worst possible moment. They tagged the Hells Angels lot with graffiti, a provocation meant to spark a clean, public fight. For a week, the air tasted of challenge. But the club's response, calibrated by Jax's insistence and the president's pragmatism, was not a brawl but a message. They repaired what had been defaced and left a single, stark addition under the mural. A small painted phrase that read like a rebuke and a benediction both. Care protects us. It was public and private at once. When the rival came sniffing for an altercation, they found coordinated calm and a group who had learned to translate tenderness into defense. The Hells Angels did not fold in fury and retribution. They moved with an organized strength that said they would not be baited into being cruel. The rival's leader left with his own pride bruised and with the knowledge that winning would require more than exploiting a rumor. Months passed and Noah grew. His laugh found them like a weather that changed the lot. He learned to recognize the rumble of a bike as something safe rather than a threat. He gurgled at helmets like toys. Mara's envelope remained folded in a drawer for a while. She watched Noah, watched Jax watching them, and she began to measure her days against things she had never allowed herself before. The steadiness of routine, the idea that a life could be built in more deliberate, chosen pieces. She never stopped making plans. The acceptance letter waited as an option, beautiful and legal and real. But the life she was choosing now was not an escape from the past. It was an entry into new territory where she would be seen, and where being seen didn't mean being owned. She cleaned the clubhouse with her old devotion because she liked the order of it. She did it now on the terms she'd named. She fed Noah when needed and sometimes sat with him while Jax rode away for a run. She learned to say no and mean it, which, in a clubhouse full of men used to getting orders, was an act of revolution. Jax learned to say more than threats and commands. He learned to negotiate, to allow gratitude to be a bridge rather than a debt. In quiet moments, when the day's noise had folded and Noah slept with a thumb in his mouth, he and Mara argued about groceries and old songs and the sound the bikes made when the wind came off the river. It was the smallest, most human currency, ordinary days traded like gold. The president's statement, praiseworthy but reserved, became a footnote in local talk. The billboard of gossip shrank as routine took over. People to work, kids to school, rides to be taken. The men who had objected either adapted or drifted away. Where the line had been drawn, new territory formed, softer but also guarded. The Patch's rulebook had been amended by living proof that tenderness could coexist with iron. That lesson cost them. It also saved them. One late afternoon, months after the fever that had reshaped their lives, Mara found herself sitting on the clubhouse stoop drinking coffee from a chipped mug while Noah crawled in the gravel, laughing at the shine on a chrome bike. Jax leaned in the doorway, watching them, his silhouette framed by warm light. He came to sit beside her wordlessly. There was no speech, only the small comfort of presence. "You could still go," he said after a long breath. "The program is still there. I won't ask." She smiled, a small, edged thing like the first sun on a new road. "The letter is still under my pillow," she said. "It's a map, and maps are for choosing. I'm choosing to stay, for now, because I want to, not because I owe you or the club." He let out a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a relief. "Good," he said, "because I can't imagine you anywhere else." No words came to tidy the world into neatness. There were still nights of rumor and days when men tested edges. There would be runs to make and disputes to settle and small betrayals to forgive. But when Noah crawled into Mara's lap and reached for Jax's beard with a tiny hand, when the two men who had once been strangers in a room that only took the hard things, nodded in a way that felt like recognition, it was clear something had shifted. The final image was simple and stubborn. Bikes lined like loyal soldiers in the half-light of evening. A small man with oil-dark hands leaning against his bike, watching his son discover the world's edges. And the woman who had fed that child, sitting on the stoop with a mug cooling in her hands, choosing, every morning and evening, to be seen and to hold to the terms she set. In a life lived at speed and on the edge of law, they had learned to find a pace that allowed for mercy without losing grit. The Hell's Angels lot would always be a place where toughness mattered. But from that summer on, there was a corner of the clubhouse where a baby's laughter and a woman's steady hands rewrote the rules, quietly, stubbornly, and with a fierce, human tenderness that refused to be turned into a ledger.